Hi, my name is Kara Hurst. I'm an Amazon employee, I'm a StolenYouth board member, and a mom. And I wanted to welcome you to our town hall event tonight. We're really excited to learn with all of you more about what we can do to fight online child sexual exploitation in our community and what we can do to come together to prevent this. At Amazon, we care deeply about our people and the communities where we live and work and operate. And we're really proud to be a partner with StolenYouth and to be able to bring this event together tonight with you to again learn more about this critical issue. So thank you for taking the time to join us tonight, and we look forward to learning what we can do together to make this world a better place for our youth. Thanks.
Thank you, Kara, and thanks to our presenting sponsor, Amazon. Thanks also to DNA Seattle, Perkins Coie, and our other important partners who are supporting this event. Hello, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for StolenYouth's annual town hall. My name is Marnie Backer, and I'm the Executive Director of StolenYouth. We appreciate you making the time today for what I hope will equip you with important information and action items that you can use to help your family and friends stay safe from online exploitation. If you have any questions of any of our panelists, please type them into the Q&A and we'll try our best to answer them following our speakers. Those of you new to StolenYouth, we've been working in the state of Washington since 2012, and our mission is to end child sex trafficking. One of our pillars that guides our work is the prevention of child sex trafficking before it even starts, which is what leads us to the topic we'll be discussing this afternoon, going online, the changing landscape of child sex trafficking. When the pandemic began early this year, we hoped we'd see a decrease in all types of trafficking. Unfortunately, the opposite is true. In fact, since March, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reports a 106% increase in reports of suspected child sexual exploitation. Cyber criminals in particular are getting more crafty and dangerous, and young people are their prey. I want to introduce a father who unfortunately had a direct experience with this. David Olson is a Naval Academy graduate and former submarine officer. After serving 5 years in the military, he pursued an MBA at the University of Chicago. Upon graduation, David joined Lehman Brothers in New York City, beginning a more than 20-year career in the financial services industry. Since 2016, David has served as an investment specialist at a Seattle financial firm. He is also the newest member of the StolenYouth Finance Committee, for which I personally appreciate him greatly. David?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Marnie. I appreciate giving some of my background. Although I will say the reason I'm here today is to talk to you a little bit more about my family and my story, and my daughter in particular, and how StolenYouth has impacted our lives. A few years ago, I moved to Seattle from New York City. I have 3 kids. My oldest is my daughter, who's 15. I'm divorced, and my kids still live with their mom in New York City. So we're cross country, but we FaceTime and talk and text regularly. In my family, as a family, we were relatively well off. I worked on Wall Street. My ex-wife was a corporate attorney. Our kids went to private school. They had all their needs taken care of for the most part. When it came time for my daughter to get a cell phone, we took the time to talk to her about social media and being safe and not being inappropriate and posting, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, she's a normal teenager with a cell phone, and she wants to be on social media. And so I just want to take a quick break in my story and talk about the social media platform. She was using mostly Instagram and Snapchat. And I will say this, I hope I don't get in trouble for this, throwing out a name, but there's a new TV documentary out called The Social Dilemma, which talks a lot about the evolution of these social media platforms, in particular Instagram and Snapchat. You know, the documentary is more, it's not about a sex trafficking standpoint, but just about the negative unintended consequences of a lot of these platforms. And as an example, the like button on Instagram, it was supposed to be this happy, feel-good feature. People could share joy and how much they like others' posts, but it turned into this huge potential negative. Kids who posted, they didn't get enough likes, and then they got depressed and they felt like they were unpopular. And it led to a significant increase in the rates of anxiety and depression and suicide among teens, particularly teenage girls. And so I just feel like it's important to bring this up, because that type of an issue is exactly the opening that online predators can use to work their way in. When you have a vulnerable, anxious youth with low self-esteem, someone comes in and makes them feel good, gives them compliments, befriends them. This is a stranger that they can work their way right in, and once they get in, and they start to develop that type of a false bond, it's hard for a child, or really for anyone, to break that cycle. So back to my story, several months ago, my ex-wife called and said that she had found some inappropriate pictures on our daughter's cell phone, and conversations with a boy, I'll put it in quotes, a boy, and our daughter. I'm certainly thankful that her mom's diligence in finding and monitoring the situation, and finding these conversations and pictures on her daughter's cell phone. I asked how concerned she was regarding the communication she saw, and she said that this boy was trying to convince our daughter to come out and actually meet him in person. So that definitely raised some red flags for us. It's especially hard for me because, again, I'm all the way across the country. But back in New York, her mom called their local police and the FBI. Here in Seattle, I called StolenYouth.
Yeah, I do.
Sorry, Alan, did you want to jump in real quick? Anyway, I'll continue. I called StolenYouth. And fortunately for me, I've been a supporter of StolenYouth. I've been involved in StolenYouth for several years. As Marnie mentioned, I'm actually a new member to the StolenYouth Finance Committee. So I knew the organization, and my first thought was to call them. StolenYouth, they don't themselves have a hotline type of immediate response, but they did put me in touch with the Polaris Project, who deals with immediate threats such as these. And so just to fast forward, we were put in touch with some local resources in New York. The FBI confiscated my daughter's phone and laptop. They launched an investigation. They determined that this supposed boy was an older man that was posing as a teenager online and trying to lure girls in. And it was a systematic operation. It was not just a one-off situation. Unfortunately, we caught this early enough, and we stepped in and we stopped it. My daughter has been in counseling, thank goodness, and we've had other resources made available to us to help educate and try to help avoid issues like this again in the future. And my point in this discussion, and hopefully that I'm able to convey this to you, to everyone on this call, is that this is a problem, and it can happen anytime, and it can happen to anyone. Child sex trafficking, it's not just limited to a particular socioeconomic class. It's not just foster kids. It's not just underprivileged kids. I never thought it could happen to me and my family. Here I am being involved in StolenYouth, and yet it did. I'm aware of the issue. I'm educated on the issue. I've tried to keep my family safe, but yet it still happened. So just my last plug for StolenYouth. They do provide funding and resources to organizations who fight this problem and try to stop it at its source. Again, I feel fortunate to be a part of the organization and to be aware of the resources that they make available. And I just can't thank them enough, and I appreciate the work they do every day. I will continue to be a supporter of them going forward, so that other families that come after me and my daughter might be able to have access to the same resources and support that were made available to us, to try to keep them safe as well in their time of need. So that's my story, and I thank you for listening, and hopefully, whether you as a family have children or if you don't, I'm sure that you have neighbors or friends or coworkers or someone that does have children, and so be aware of the issue, try to spread the word, and support organizations that try to fight this. Thank you.
David. We are having some technical difficulties. We're going to go to Stacie B. Harris, but now we're going to skip Stacie because she's trying to get her slides to work, and we're going straight to Brooke Istook. Sorry, I'm just shuffling my notes. So Brooke works for Thorn, which is a nonprofit co-founded by Ashton Kutcher and Demi Moore, and it uses technology to combat online child sex abuse. Brooke leads the vision and strategy for Thorn's work focused on empowering children and communities to be resilient in the face of threats they face online. Brooke joined Thorn in 2014 to lead the development and deployment of Spotlight, Thorn's sex trafficking investigation tool, and helped build Thorn's strategy, product, and operational capabilities. Prior to that, she spent over 12 years working in tech consulting, operations, and program management. She is a graduate from the University of Alabama. Roll Tide. And Brooke, you're on mute, but welcome.
All right. Can you guys hear me now? All right. Okay, let me share. This is always the tricky part, sharing the screen. Okay. And let me present here. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see this now, but please someone yell if you can't. Hello everyone, I'm really excited to spend some time with you all today and talk to you about some research we've done recently. As has been mentioned, I work with Thorn. We build technology to defend children from sexual abuse. We work at the intersection of technology and child sexual exploitation. And our work primarily rolls up into three key strategic pillars. The first is that we build tech for law enforcement and NGOs to help accelerate victim identification. Second, we build tech and best practices for tech companies to help them identify, take down, and report child sexual abuse material on their platforms and to make their platforms as safe as possible for children. And then we take the knowledge that we've learned by working with law enforcement, NGOs, and tech companies that all sit on the front lines of abuse. We take that knowledge and we use it to educate and empower kids in their communities to be resilient in the face of the threats they may encounter online. So we take what we know about the tactics, what's being used, as David talked about, and ensure that that knowledge is transferred so that communities can combat these issues that children are facing online. Back in 2018, when working with law enforcement NGO partners, we heard from them that there was a different type of child sexual abuse imagery that was on the rise. We learned that what we call self-generated child sexual abuse material, it was being reported as one of the fastest growing areas of abuse material that was spreading online on the internet and also being consumed in communities of offenders. And law enforcement was finding this spread around. Now, self-generated child sexual abuse material, to be clear, is sexually explicit images and videos that appear to have been taken or produced by a child. There are several different pathways that can result in this type of imagery being created. One is kind of what we would call grooming scenario or coercion, which is what David talked about, where an adult perpetrator befriends a child online, coerces them to produce content, and in some of the worst cases, convinces them to meet up. So it can be created that way and distributed from there. It can also happen in like a non-coercive way where two teens are consensually sharing nudes in a relationship and something can happen and that gets leaked and things go sideways and it spreads from there. Or it can happen through images captured through a live stream. Maybe teen partners are live streaming, something gets captured or even otherwise, and those images are captured and leaked and spread from there. There's a range of ways that it can happen. And depending on the level of coercion, whether or not there's an adult involved, the range of harm is quite different. So what happens is that content gets spread and then law enforcement comes across it, either online or when they're dealing with these communities of offenders online. They find it and all they can tell is that it looks like the image was taken by the child themselves. They don't know the context. They can't tell if it was coercive, a grooming situation, or just something happening between teenagers that went sideways. So it makes it really complicated for them to triage and focus on some of the most dangerous and harmful situations. There was a report put out by NetClean in 2018 where they surveyed investigators. About 90% of the officers said this type of content was significant and growing portion of their caseload. So, and you know what, it's not surprising for those of you that are listening that are parents, especially parents of teenagers, right? We know and we hear that sexting is on the rise among kids. And we also know about the increased vulnerability that we talked about earlier to grooming with kids being online more and more, especially as a result of COVID. So with all this happening, we determined that this was a unique situation because the child is involved in capturing the image themselves, that this was a unique opportunity to try to intervene with education and behavior change with the child themselves, help them be better equipped to face these situations online so that they make a different decision in those critical moments. So we set a goal in 2019 to try to stem the tide of this self-generated material online, try to curb the growth and eliminate it from the internet. To do that, we really needed to understand how it was happening. So we set out to start to see what research was out there. And you know what, there was some research out there, but what we found by doing lit reviews and looking at what other researchers had put forth is that a lot of the research was about 5 to 10 years old. We looked at meta-analysis that ran from like 2000, that looked at studies running from 2005 to 2015. So, you know, as we looked at this, and we work in tech, right? So when you think about kids in tech, information that's 5 to 10 years old is beyond stale. So we needed to understand what kids are experiencing right now. We wanted to understand what their online, kids today, what their online experience was, how they think about strangers online, how they interact with strangers online, what risk and vulnerabilities are there, so we can try to figure out how to address them. So for these reasons, we decided to use kind of an innovative approach to research. We decided to conduct market research to have a more rapid research cycle to speak directly to kids. So we can not only hear and kind of elevate their voice in this conversation, but also ground whatever interventions we might come up with in understanding their experience. And also to do it rapidly so we can action those insights quickly and make them as relevant and timely as possible. So our research in 2019, we started with focus groups, and then we did online diaries, and then we did a survey of 1,000 kids ages 9 to 17 to understand this increasingly common behavior of sharing explicit imagery. 3 key findings came out of this study. One, maybe the obvious, producing and sharing is increasingly common, and many kids view it as normal. 2, that the experiences vary significantly depending on the amount of coercion and consent, actually, and how this stuff gets out. And the harm drastically increases when images originally shared consensually spread beyond the intended recipient. And lastly, that the reactions when kids do seek help, when things spiral out of control, they're often met with blame or inaction, which makes the harm even that much more significant in those moments and further isolating kids in moments when they need help the most. So diving in, when we first started doing the survey, the first questions we dove into with kids to hear directly about their experience was how they feel about sharing nudes. Not only themselves, but also what are they seeing in their peers to try to get an understanding of the environment and how they view things. We learned that 11% of kids reported sharing nudes. 1 in 5 teen girls have shared nudes. 1 in 10 teen boys have shared nudes. We also learned that 1 in 3 kids that had shared nudes had shared them with a stranger, someone they had never met before, which is very scary. And then if you see some of these charts here, you look across different demographics, and it's clear that different kids have different experiences, right? So girls, we found, were more likely to share than boys. The risk does increase with age, with kind of 15 and above being the highest likelihood of sharing. We also learned that LGBTQ youth share nearly twice as much, or was twice as likely to share as other kids. And the risk also, this was an unexpected finding, the risk also seems to be increasing in households with higher income. We don't know why. That's a very initial finding that we want to unpack in the future, but it is something that emerged from the data. The other thing that we learned is that because these are types of behaviors that kids might be hesitant to self-report, right? So we did a lot of questions about themselves sharing with their friends and kids at their school. Those were kind of the range of questions. Do you share? Do kids at your school share? Do your friends, right? To try to get a sense of the normalcy of this behavior. And 40% of teens say that sharing nudes is normal for kids their age. The other thing that we learned actually is that kids, their own experience of sharing nudes was not consistently negative. The most frequent sentiment reported from kids when it came to sharing nudes was positive. So 43% of kids who had shared nudes themselves reported feeling beautiful, empowered, good in their own skin, generally positive sentiments. The flip side of that is that there definitely were negative feelings associated. That was the second most reported feeling, was negative feelings, at about 36% of kids reporting things like guilt, shame, and embarrassment. But this just shows us that this is very much a nuanced conversation, right? And the more we can understand kids' experience of these issues, the more we can be prepared to talk to them about it in a productive and helpful and supportive way. Now moving on, now, as I mentioned before, the idea of sharing your own news, right? There are mixed feelings about that. But what was abundantly clear is that the non-consensual resharing is a significant source of fear and shame. So there's no doubt. We can debate maybe the level of harm on the initial share, maybe between two kids that are romantically involved, right? Like maybe there's varying degrees of harm there, but there's no doubt the harm once that breaks outside of that trust and gets spread among friends, communities, and beyond. And unfortunately, it's happening more than we might think. Between 10 and 20% of kids actually self-reported non-consensually sharing other people's nudes. But if you look at this chart, this is about kids who have seen nudes of others. If you fold in prefer not to say, that was another way we tried to get around the hesitancy to report. If you fold in prefer not to say, as many as 40% of kids aged 13 to 17 have seen nudes of someone else their own age without their consent. So it's definitely happening, right? And more than maybe we thought. But because we know that the threat of harm is so much more significantly compounded when they're leaked, especially, this just underscores the need for prevention and interventions, not only with the child taking the photo, but the kids that are engaging in the sharing and spreading of that. So unfortunately, you know, these situations happens. Kids make maybe less than ideal decisions, right? Or unwise decisions, let's say. But when things do go sideways in those situations, unfortunately, kids anticipate many hurdles to getting help. Because we found in the research that because there's such a significant culture of blame and shame around sharing nudes, kids that find themselves in this situation can feel terribly isolated and alone in a critical moment of need. Here you can see across kids and adults, kind of the attitudes around blame as it pertains to nudes. More than half of kids either exclusively or mostly blame the victim if nudes were leaked. Even among kids, and this shocked me, even among kids who had shared nudes themselves, more than a third exclusively blamed the victim. If you look at caregivers, they're also more likely to blame the victim. 60% of caregiver men either exclusively or mostly blame the victim. And there were some interesting gender dynamics at play among caregivers, which showed a need for continuous research around those demographics. But for female caregivers, the gender of their own child actually played a role in who they felt was at fault. 47% of female caregivers with sons said the victim only was to blame, compared to 25% of female caregivers that had daughters. Very interesting. And the other interesting thing that we found with caregivers is that while they do blame the child in the photo, the victim, if their nude is leaked, nearly half of caregivers said it was normal to share nudes in an adult relationship. So just something for us to think about there. Mostly just because I think just this dynamic of kind of do as I say, not as I do type dynamic that we just need to think about as parents when we're talking to our kids. In an effort, when it comes to caregivers and kids, of course, we want to educate them on the potential risks of sharing nudes. But in an effort to protect their kids and keep them safe, prevention conversations we heard from caregivers mostly revolved around discipline and consequence. The central theme tends to be permanence, loss of control. Once you share it, it's gone, and you're responsible for that, right? The message they get is, if you hadn't said it in the first place, you wouldn't be in this situation. You should have known better, right? And these were comments that we were getting in the research. Unfortunately, there's a lot of, slut shaming happening at both the kids and caregivers level, right? And kids that share nudes are being disproportionately blamed. Yes, they're making a risky choice, but they're also being shouldered with the actions of others who've broken their trust and who are sharing images without their consent. There seems to be very little conversation happening about that resharing activity and placing the blame fully on the shoulders of the kid that created the image. So when kids inevitably make some bad decisions, right? And you're asking them, and they need help, right? Things are spiraling out of control. Their images are spreading around. They do need help in those situations, but asking them to feel comfortable coming forward, knowing that this is the reaction that they'll get, is a really tall order. So we need to change the narrative. We need to figure out how we can safeguard, how we can give them all the information they need about the risks in making these decisions without silencing them when things go sideways. Kids need to know and have confidence that we will be there for them if things go wrong, and know that they won't be condemned for making a bad decision. We need to separate that responsibility and blame conversation out. And if you think about it, so much of what drives this behavior with kids is not unique to them. If you think about what might motivate a kid to share a nude, it's acceptance, it's popularity, it's feeling beautiful, it's feeling empowered. And those aren't vulnerabilities that you can wipe away from being a teenager, because they continue throughout our lives. That's part of being human, right? And so layering in, the risk, the developmentally appropriate risk-taking that teenagers also have, coupled with these other feelings, these types of things can happen. And the other piece of this is that because so often they're told that once they share news, they're never going to get it back. It's always going to haunt you. Once this happens, it can lead them feeling hopeless about getting to the other side. And the truth is that with help, they can. And we need to remember that in our conversations when we try to protect them. So like I said, while it's important for sure for us to talk about permanence, talk about the results, talk about the risks and what can happen, we also want to equip caregivers to have more nuanced conversations, come to those conversations with a tone of understanding, building trust, less judgment, and also be proactive, have those conversations often and as early as possible. I know these are tough and scary issues to talk about. And, as parents, we're not always going to handle them perfectly. But I think if we're setting a solid foundation, having these conversations, demonstrating that that love and support. Even if we don't react perfectly in the moment, our kids will know that we'll have their back in those moments. The other piece of this is, in addition to having more nuanced and supportive conversations around these really tough topics, we also need to have these conversations early enough so that kids are equipped with the knowledge they need when they encounter these situations for the first time, right? As David talked about, there's people online posing as kids, reaching out to kids constantly, more than we even know. In some of our online campaigns directed at kids to have conversations about these topics, kids are reporting that they have been asked for nudes online as young as 8 years old. We hear commonly 10. I was first asked when I was 10, 11, 9, 8. Frankly, it's shocking. And while, as you can see here, our research shows that the sharing of them actually spikes at age 15 and older. I'm going to kind of highlight the younger ages here. 13% of 11 to 12-year-olds have seen non-consensually shared nudes. 1 in 10 11 to 12-year-olds have actually reshared someone else's nudes, and 7% have shared their own. When you look at 9 to 10-year-olds, as many as 7% at that age have seen leaked nudes. So, you know, I have a 7-year-old. The thought of having conversations like these, frankly, scare me, but I also want him to be prepared when this starts happening, and I want to be the one to set that frame for him so that he's prepared and knowledgeable and knows how to react in any one of these types of situations related to explicit imagery online. The other thing I wanted to mention here is that we cannot underscore enough the important role parents play in teaching their kids to be safe online. We actually asked kids how they learned about online safety. And they don't look for it online. They hear it from their caregivers, their educators, from their friends, and caregivers by far play the biggest role. Overall, nearly 7 in 10 kids ages 9 to 17 say caregivers are the primary ones to teach them how to behave online. And that number jumps up to 8 in 10 kids ages 9 to 12. Kids of all ages, you know, they're looking for cues from the adults in their life about how to behave online. But as they get older, as probably parents of teenagers know, there are signs that they start to form their own online habits and they're less dependent on others. Younger kids, and especially young females, are much more likely to say that any given person or resource teaches them how to act, which reiterates the importance of early interventions. Talking to them while they're still listening to us, right? And while they're still open and they're forming the frame through which they view online safety. So talking to them early while that's being formed and before these situations start happening. Now, when it comes to caregivers, they actually are, fortunately, the majority of them, 62%, said they are having that nude sharing conversation, which is awesome. That's great news. But they are kind of waiting a little bit too late until the kids get older to have it, which is understandable. Among parents who have not had the conversation with their kids about sharing nudes, as you can see here, 51% have kids in elementary school, 40% in middle school, and 31% in high school. In our focus group with kids, with some high schoolers in particular, sharing nudes was old news, right? When there were the big situations that it spread throughout the school, that law enforcement got involved, that was all in junior high. So this is happening early. We need to have those conversations so they're prepared for it when they're faced with it. And holding off on that conversation comes at too significant of a cost. High school is definitely too late. But even for those that are having the conversation, like I mentioned before, they are still heavily weighted towards permanency. Once you press send, it's out of your control. You can't get it back, right? So we need to add a little bit more nuance to that conversation. So we give kids the confidence to come forward. while parents do play an important role in teaching kids how to behave online, there's conflicting evidence about the support that they provide when kids have issues related to nudes and leaked nudes. On the one hand, 74% of kids aged 9 to 12 said they would turn to a caregiver for help if they or someone they knew had something shared on social that they didn't want shared. Only 48% of kids aged 13 to 17 said the same. We also heard from the focus groups that kids report they'd rather not talk to a parent, or they would rather talk to a non-parent or a friend because they feared disappointing. That was a huge thing, disappointing their caregiver or being punished. So this tension that we saw come out in the focus groups, you can see it in this quote right here, suggests that kids probably feel like and know they should talk to their caregiver, but feel like there are obstacles that prevent them from doing so, like judgment or fear. So one thing is clear that we've been discussing today is that when these situations spiral out of control, harm is prolonged if the kids can't get help, right? In addition to not telling parents, kids also weren't consistently reporting to platforms when bad situations happened to them on those apps. Oftentimes they'd use things like blocking, but they were hesitant to actually report it for fear of being called a snitch, for fear of being removed from the platform. And more than anything, because 40% of them didn't think it would do any good. So not only do we have work to do in as the community surrounding children to protect them from the threats they face online, as caregivers, as teachers, also when it comes to the apps in which they operate, there's more work to do to make sure that when those kids are there and in those situations, they feel confident that if they sound an alarm, someone will help them. So it's clear they need help every step of the way. And we've got to work together, as was mentioned earlier, to make sure not only our communities, but the systems in which kids operate are protective and supporting them, so that we can be there when they need help the most. So that is it for our research. There's like a 45-page report for anyone that's interested. Feel free to go to our website. And I know there's also resources that will be shared after this for parents from some of our partners like the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children and others that have guides for parents on how to have these conversations with children of various ages. So we hope that this is a starting point for not only caregivers. I know I was talking about the caregivers a lot today, not only for caregivers, but for all of us as a community to come around kids and support them. And I hope this is the start of a conversation and having insights that can be helpful in those moments. So thank you.
Thank you, Brooke. And quick question, I don't know if you're still on. I know you have, oh, there you are. In Texas, so it's dinner time for your kids at your house. But I'm going to answer the questions or put them out to the panelists at the end of the presentation. But real quick, someone asked about the acronym SG-CSAM. Can you tell us what that is?
Yes, great question. That's, I spoke about it a couple times, it's self-generated child sexual abuse material. So that's a category that we use to kind of encompass all of that imagery that's produced, whether it's coercive or not. It's that kind of category. That's what we used to call it.
Okay, great, thank you. Really appreciate the information, Brooke, and thank you for your time today. Now we're going to shift back to Stacie Harris. Stacie's had some technical issues. I'm not a tech person. I'm in Seattle, she's in Florida, so I don't think that has anything to do with it, but I don't know what's going on exactly. But we might be missing her slides, but she is on her phone. And Stacie is going to talk about the threat assessment of what online child exploitation looks like. Stacie is an Associate Deputy Attorney General at the U.S. Department of Justice, where she coordinates child exploitation, human trafficking, and civil rights programs. Since joining the department in 2008 as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Middle District of Florida, and later as chief of the Special Victims Section, Ms. Harris has prosecuted cases involving child exploitation, sex trafficking, violent crimes, and national security offenses. She previously served as an associate at a Florida law firm, and she has been honored as Florida's Human Trafficking Prosecutor of the Year, and she also received the FBI Director's Award for her dedication and expertise in human trafficking. Welcome, Stacie.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. So I want to thank Marnie as well as StolenYouth for inviting me to speak to you all today. As Marnie stated, I apologize. I've had a lot of technical difficulty. I was on the Zoom, but have since got kicked off and my computer is not reconnecting. So I'm sorry I'm not able to share my slides with you. I'm going to do a little bit of a threat assessment about what we're seeing in the child sexual exploitation space. As a career federal prosecutor, I'm deeply committed to seeking justice for victims and survivors of child exploitation and human trafficking. And I'm honored to serve currently in the leadership role coordinating the many partners across the Department of Justice and beyond who are working together to protect victims and bring offenders to justice, which is one of the highest priorities of the Department of Justice. Most of you all work daily or have contact with our most vulnerable population, which is our children. And we're grateful that you have joined today's presentation to learn how we can work together to strengthen our shared commitment to combating crimes against children. Even prior to COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, the online threat to children around the world had never been greater. The challenges that we faced then and continue to encounter when combating these threats continues to increase, unfortunately, with no end in sight. Online child sexual exploitation and abuse is a global crime, and it demands a global response. In an increasingly digital and borderless world, this crime, unfortunately, is becoming easier to commit. It's becoming much more extreme in nature, and it is growing in numbers. These crimes have a devastating and lasting impact on the victims and survivors. As technology rapidly evolves, offenders are continuously adapting and diversifying their methods. So keeping children safe from online sexual exploitation and abuse and limiting their re-victimization by stopping the sharing and viewing of those sexual abuse images can only be achieved through robust collaboration. To that end, the Departments of Justice and Homeland Security, along with the governments from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, consulted and worked with a wide range of stakeholders, including a leading group of technology industry representatives, to develop a set of voluntary principles to counter online child sexual exploitation and abuse. These principles aim to provide an aspirational standard of care for the internet. Industry leaders, to include Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Roblox, Snap, and Twitter, were involved in creating these principles, and all agree that each and every principle is in fact important. Because every country has different laws and every technology company provides different products or services, these principles are voluntary, and it is up to the company to determine what implementation of each individual principle looks like on their platform. It is also our hope that parents, guardians, caregivers, teachers, and members of the community will be able to use the voluntary principles to understand how they can better keep their kids safe when online. If you or a child that you love uses an internet platform or technological device that doesn't seek to prevent and remove child sexual abuse material, if it doesn't take meaningful efforts to target online grooming or live streaming, or adopt enhanced safety measures to protect children, then we hope that you will really consider whether or not that product or service is safe for your child. As law enforcement, unfortunately, we're getting to a point where we can only do so much to protect children online. As technology continues to evolve and you're having more things like encryption and anonymization, As that becomes more prevalent, law enforcement is losing its ability to effectively investigate and prosecute these cases. It is our hope that the voluntary principles will help parents and caregivers better protect your children and students online. I'm going to quickly go through the voluntary principles with you and give you a little background as to why each principle is important. So, the Cyber Tip Line Modernization Act requires electronic service providers to alert the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, otherwise known as NCMEC, if they are aware of violations of federal law that pertain to child exploitation. When electronic service providers locate child sexual abuse imagery on their sites, they then contact NCMEC through the Cyber Tip Line. Although all U.S. technology companies are subject to this law, if a company is not aware of sexual abuse images on its sites or the child exploitation occurring on its platform, it does not have a duty to report that information. Unfortunately, there are companies that do choose to be willfully blind and not monitor their platforms, and therefore do not report at all or report very, very few abuses to the Cyber Tip Line. The Cyber Tip Line received over 1 million cyber tips from around the world for the first time in 2014. 4 short years later, in 2018, the number of global cyber tips increased to well over 18 million. On average, that is 34 cyber tips a minute that's coming in that relates to some type of online sexual abuse of children. Of those 18.4 million cyber tips, over 70% alone came from Facebook Messenger. And that's because Facebook Messenger and Facebook in general as a company has been very proactive in monitoring its platform, looking for and detecting this material, and when it finds it, has reported it to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And as a result of Facebook's proactivity, many children have been recovered, many offenders have been identified, investigated, and prosecuted because of Facebook's proactivity. Unfortunately, once Facebook fully encrypts its platform, as it has announced, Facebook, the company, will no longer be able to see or report that content that they have on their platform. So we know that those millions of cyber tips to NCMEC will no longer occur. We know that the conduct will not go away, the sexual abuse that's happening, but Facebook's knowledge of the conduct and their ability to report it and our ability to investigate it will go away. So principles 1 and 2 of the voluntary principles address the prevention of child sexual abuse materials online. Principle 1 states that companies should seek to prevent known child sexual abuse material from being made available to users or accessible on their platforms and services, and take appropriate action under their terms of service and report to appropriate authorities. Principle 2 states that companies should seek to prevent new child sexual abuse material from being made available to users or accessible on their platforms and services, and should take appropriate action under their terms of service and report to appropriate authorities. Principles 1 and 2 specifically address the prevention of child sexual abuse materials online. Companies, non-governmental organizations, and law enforcement agencies have done significant work to identify and catalog child sexual abuse materials. This process actually helps us prevent the continued circulation of such materials and avoid further re-victimization of the children depicted. We know that once some of these images are created and then shared on the internet, they can be continued to be shared for years and years and years. And every time those images continue to be shared, that victim is being re-traumatized. We know that these children suffer ongoing and additional trauma every single time the materials depicting their abuse is viewed. By technology companies being able to reduce the availability of known material, it can also help further offending. Principle 2 deals specifically with new material. And the threat to children depicted in new material is very different than images that are already out on the internet and continue to circulate. Newly generated material is more likely to indicate current and ongoing offending, such as against an unidentified victim who continues to be abused, or a child that is being groomed and coerced into producing new abusive images. Like, David discussed earlier in the story of his daughter, it was great that his wife was able to intervene when she did. But unfortunately, we have several cases where there are adult offenders online who are targeting children, who coerce them into self-producing images. And actually we can see the grooming behavior and how the progression of the images continues. Text identification and technologies companies' ability to identify these materials and their referral to appropriate authorities is time critical in saving children. When we see an image of child sexual abuse that has never been seen before, that is an indication to us that a child is being abused in real time very quickly. And so our biggest priority in that moment is to identify that image, the victim in the image, and where the image came from so that we can recover the child if necessary. In the last 10 years, law enforcement has seen the emergence of new crimes and methods due to the advancement of technology. Offenders often go where the victims they are targeting are located. Consequently, we know that offenders frequent apps like Snapchat, Instagram, and TikTok. Online grooming is a preparatory phase in which someone builds trust and rapport with a child or a third party, such as their guardian or sibling, in order to gain access to that child for the purposes of sexual activity. A large percentage of the minor sex trafficking cases that we investigate and prosecute originate online. Traffickers often use social media to make contact with and recruit victims into human trafficking. Many minors, unfortunately, have no idea that they are being preyed upon at the time traffickers or offenders in general are targeting them. Principles 3 and 4 of the voluntary principles address online grooming and preparatory behavior. Principle 3 states that companies should seek to identify preparatory child sexual exploitation and abuse activity, such as online grooming for the purposes of child sexual abuse. They should take appropriate action under their terms of service and report to appropriate authorities. Under Principle 4, companies should seek to identify and prevent advertising, recruiting, soliciting, or procuring a child for sexual abuse. Take appropriate action under their terms of service and report to the appropriate authorities. We expect companies to attempt to identify and disrupt grooming actions happening on their platforms in an effort to prevent more serious harm from occurring to children. Several technology companies are already doing this. I know Microsoft, for example, has been working for years on a project that works to detect grooming of children online so that they can identify a lot of this behavior before it actually turns into a child sexual abuse situation. Now that the internet has brought the world closer together, an offender anywhere around the globe can reach into someone's home, into someone's family, and can cause catastrophic harm. In sextortion offenses, the production of images is only one part of the crime. Offenders then use the photos that they receive from minors to force children to produce additional images, many of which escalate in severity. We know that the sextortion of children causes extreme psychological harm, and oftentimes law enforcement's ability to stop offenders from publishing sexually explicit images is low because we cannot determine the offender's identity or location. Unfortunately, the constant fear of exposure and embarrassment causes feelings of hopelessness, which sometimes sadly leads to suicide. Within the last few years, we have been seeing offenders using business meeting technology to meet live online in groups to participate in and view the sexual abuse of a child. With this technology, the offenders can make special requests and record the abuse as it occurs on their individual electronic devices. Similarly, live on-demand technology makes live streaming of real-time child sexual abuse possible no matter where you are in the world. It has created a market where affluent offenders can easily exploit the poor and the vulnerable on the other side of the world from the comforts and privacy of their living rooms. Children in countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, and the Philippines are suffering higher incidences of abuse because of their poverty. Unfortunately, we have several offenders and defendants who have been prosecuted who have identified victims in some of these third world countries, who have paid and sent money via cash processing applications, and then been able to have children abused live on screen for them. And it's something that they do very regularly. And because of poverty, parents, caregivers, friends in these countries are willingly exploiting the children just to have an opportunity to make some money. And that, that's something StolenYouth focuses on sex trafficking, but that is a cyber sex trafficking that we have seen grown exponentially over the last few years. And as more and more of these poor countries have more accessible Wi-Fi and internet, we only expect this to, the numbers of this type of cyber sex trafficking to increase. Principle 5 of the voluntary principle seeks to address the harm of live streaming. Principle 5 states that companies should seek to identify and prevent child sexual exploitation and abuse facilitated or amplified by live streaming, take appropriate action under their terms of service, and report to appropriate authorities. Live streaming is particularly complex because it allows offenders to engage in child sexual abuse production in real time, which leaves limited to no evidence. It is important that companies work to identify and prevent live streamed child sexual exploitation and take appropriate action under their terms of service to make sure it gets reported to authorities. Principle 6 of the voluntary principles addresses offenders' ability to search and locate child sexual abuse material on different platforms. Principle 6 states that companies should seek to prevent searches from surfacing child sexual exploitation and abuse activity and sexual exploitation and abuse activity and material, and seek to prevent automatic suggestions for child sexual exploitation and abuse activity and material. Prevention efforts that address access to child sexual abuse material are fundamental to ending this abuse. Searching for child sexual exploitation and abuse using related terms gives current or potential offenders an easy way to access child sexual abuse material. Unfortunately, individuals are often able to access child sexual abuse material using some of our very popular internet, God, I just totally lost the word. I'm sorry, internet search engines. Mainstream ways of accessing this material, unfortunately, it absolutely normalizes the process of seeking it out because it is so accessible. Additionally, algorithms that suggest child sexual abuse material could also have the effect of encouraging or inspiring new offending, as well as increasing the re-victimization of those who have already been abused. We are hoping, and I know some technology companies have already started working on providing users with details of how to report illegal material and information, as well as support services for those who are at risk of offending when searching for this type of material on platforms. Crowdsourcing is where groups of offenders will search for victims online and work together to lure them into private chat rooms and then trick them into self-producing explicit videos. These offenders will often exploit hundreds of victims in one single sitting. However, the victims do not often realize what has happened, as they believe that they were actually chatting and exchanging video with an age-appropriate partner, when really the offender was an adult using a false persona. These offenders, in some of these cases that we have come across more recently, has these offenders working together, and these offenders have defined roles and tasks. You have offenders that are solely responsible for finding the targets. You have those who actually pose as minors when chatting with the target. You have those who create video to use as part of a lure. And then you also have offenders who capture the new content produced by the victim. And by working together, these offenders are able to cover more ground on the internet. They're able to target more children, and they have been very, very successful in getting these victims to produce and create child sexual abuse material. Principle 7 of the voluntary principles points out that there are identified risks that are unique to children online. Principle 7 states that companies should seek to adopt enhanced safety measures with the aim of protecting children, and in particular from peers or adults seeking to engage in harmful sexual activity with children. In some cases, this may include efforts to ascertain the age of the user. We know that the particular risks to children include content risk, where the child is the recipient of unwelcome and inappropriate content. Children are also susceptible to contact risks, where a child participates in risky communication with an offender, possibly unwittingly or unwillingly. And children are also susceptible to conduct risk, where a child's behavior contributes to risky content or contact. We hope that technology companies consider these risks when thinking about the safety of its users and consider implementing processes like age verification to understand whether users are children when it is appropriate. Now, the production of child pornography is the federal charge that prosecutors use for the very worst of the worst offenders. This statute is used when we have an offender who creates or produces horrific images of child sexual abuse. Although this offense criminalizes the actual image, far more despicable conduct often accompanies those images, to include voyeurism, grooming children to take sexually explicit images of their own bodies, as well as hands-on molestation and rape that often include sadomasochistic conduct and bestiality. Over the last 10 years, we have seen a drastic change where before we often saw offenders transmitting images or sharing images that they had already accessed on the internet. So we were seeing a lot of offenders transmitting and sharing images of child sexual abuse material. Now these offenders are actually engaging in hands-on abuse and creating more and more photos and videos. Between just 2008 and 2018, that 10-year period, the number of production charges filed in federal cases increased 160%. This is largely due to the accessibility of cameras and the ease of capturing moments in time. Child sex offenders no longer have to go to a seedy adult bookstore to find these images or worry about their misdeeds being exposed when trying to have film developed at a store like Eckerd's. They can now reach into their pockets and use their mobile phones. Digital cameras are all around us, and as a culture, we have reached a point where we now tell our life stories through images, videos, and social media. So as a result, offenders their behavior has absolutely progressed, and it has progressed very quickly over the last 10 years from not just sharing the images, but actually creating it. And all of those production charges When we talk about 160% increase, most of those production charges, all of them, they represent a child who has been physically abused. And unfortunately, we expect these numbers to increase due to COVID-19. Children, some for the first time, are regularly accessing computer cameras and live streaming technology for school. Unfortunately, a lot of schools, teachers, and parents are not adequately prepared on how to protect their children from online predators. Principle 8 of the voluntary principle deals with victim-led considerations. Principle 8 states that companies should consider mechanisms, including those that could be pursued by children, parents, guardians, and victims, to better enable identification, reporting, and removal of material that is not illegal per se, but may be connected to child sexual exploitation and abuse, or leave children vulnerable to abuse. We know that material depicting child sexual exploitation and abuse is illegal. However, there are certain types of images, videos, and discussions and other recordings that may fall below the threshold of being illegal, but they still do warrant some action and should still be removed from these platforms. Identifying and taking appropriate action on this material can reduce new and ongoing opportunities for victimization. For example, self-generated images can indicate a child is being groomed and coerced into producing images, or can be shared beyond the original recipient, causing significant distress to the child. As a society, we have deemed it inappropriate for adult men to play on playgrounds, at museums, or in parks alone with children that they do not know. However, we have allowed that conduct to occur online. We are starting to see more and more combined platforms that bring kids and adults together with no oversight or meaningful protection. When playing video games, it is not uncommon for adults and children to play together as peers for hours and hours to accomplish a shared task. While tech has historically designed platforms to protect identity and protect against threats like malware, currently there's little safety by design to account for threats to children. As a result, we are seeing many more children being targeted and abused in places that they have historically been safe. Some of the places we've heard about are a paper doll application that a young 6-year-old girl was playing on, as well as many gaming platforms where young boys are being coerced into producing images when playing games with adults. Principles 9 through 11 focus on the fact that criminal means and methods evolve quickly as offenders exploit new technology. And these offenders are exploiting this new technology to commit online sexual exploitation and abuse. So under Principle 9, it states that companies should consider children's safety when designing their services and platforms, and continually adapt, revise, and enhance their services and global approach to combat online child sexual exploitation and abuse in collaboration with experts. Principle 10 states that companies should seek to create opportunities to share relevant expertise, best practices, and tools where appropriate and feasible. And in Principle 11, companies should seek to regularly publish or share meaningful data and insights on their efforts to combat child sexual exploitation and abuse. Wrapping up, as most of you all know, COVID-19 has exacerbated the problem of online child sexual abuse. Children across the globe have a significantly increased online presence, and increasing the risk that they might come into contact with online sexual predators who seek out young victims on popular apps, websites, and social media platforms. We know that many children are using webcams to participate in remote learning and to communicate with friends and families. This increased familiarity with sharing personal videos and images online can create a false sense of comfort. Because most parents are also having to work from home, kids are being supervised less while online. All of this has created the perfect storm. The Department of Justice, along with the governments and technology companies that created the voluntary principles, have created public service announcements for keeping children safe online during the COVID-19 pandemic. You can access those PSAs along with tips on how to keep children safe online, as well as additional resources at www.justice.gov/coronavirus. Also, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children recently launched a website called a Safety Pledge that has a toolkit for parents on how to keep their children safe online. So thank you for your time, and please let me know if I can answer any questions for you all.
Thank you so much, Stacie. We really appreciate the information as upsetting as it is to hear. I think we all need to be aware. And we will be emailing these resources to everyone who signed up for this webinar, including the safety pledge that Stacie just referenced. So you will receive those resources along with other resources that you can use. And also I encourage you to keep the questions going because our panelists will be available following the next presentation for a brief Q&A. And so last but not least, I'm proud to introduce my boss and StolenYouth Board Chair, Alan Brown. Alan is the co-founder and CEO of DNA, which is one of Seattle's largest and most successful independent advertising and branding agencies. Alan began his work with StolenYouth by volunteering DNA's talents to the organization's marketing and communication needs, including strategic planning, branding, messaging, and event support. And then he joined the board in 2016. Alan lives on Mercer Island with his partner and 2 teenage children. And this evening, Alan is going to present to you a new StolenYouth program that will help in the fight against online exploitation. And we're calling it Project Sugar Free. Alan?
Thank you, Marnie. Let me take a second and just share my slides here. So thank you. I'm really excited to share with you an initiative from StolenYouth that we've been working on for the past few months, and it is literally brand new as we are getting ready to launch it live, and it's called Project Sugar Free. And the way Project Sugar Free came about is, as Marnie mentioned, I work for a company, a communications company in Seattle called DNA. And the head of our data strategy practice, Rob Scherzer, noticed one day as he was looking at our some of our social data intelligence software that we were running for some of our financial services clients, he noticed a lot of content coming up that was using sugar-related language, things, words like sugar baby, sugar daddy, sugar mommy, things like that. And we started talking about this, and we realized that this content were actual people reaching out to young men and women, trying to entice them into the world of sugaring, which is basically going on a date or getting together in exchange for something of value, money, rent, tuition, for which leading to sex. And so we had this thought that what if we used our data analytics tools and automated AI to educate and potentially dissuade potential victims from getting into sugaring, and then also to intercept conversations with potential abusers. And so we've been working for the past few months on developing automated technology and bots to be used on Twitter to intercept these conversations and hopefully to reduce this activity. Another thing that's important to know is that sugaring is an exploding phenomenon in our country with high school students and college students. And so we felt this was a worthwhile project to take on. Luckily, some very generous members of the StolenYouth board have funded the development of this project, and it's been under development for, like I said, for the past few months. So the goals of Project Sugar Free are first to use facts and data to dissuade vulnerable populations from entering into sugaring relationships, which we know and have proven to be on-ramps to sex trafficking. And we also know that anybody under the age of 18 who is involved in this is a victim of child sex trafficking. The second goal we have is to report and remove abusers and potential criminals from the Twitter platform. And third is to put an end to the normalization and glamorization of prostitution and to act as that counterbalance for the Seeking Arrangements efforts. Seeking Arrangements is a site that has been promoting sugaring, and so we're trying to really kind of intercept those conversations and provide that counterbalance. The way the Project Sugar Free works is pretty simple. First of all, we scour Twitter for language that appears to be talking about sugaring. We then capture that data and organize it in terms of what the content is about, and we sort that by audience and by geography. We then intercept and reply to comments made on Twitter with an appropriate library of hundreds of responses and graphics that are designed to discourage future engagement, whether it's with a potential victim or an abuser. And then finally, we're going to report and measure what we're finding. So the sugar-free bots collect the information, all the mentions, we organize it by audience and geography, and then report that back out to look at the success that we are having. The audiences that we're really trying to reach are four. The first are potential victims or those who are curious. So people who seem to be targeted for sugaring, or those who are using language inquiring about sugaring. The second are abusers, and these are self-defined sugar daddies and sugar mommies who are looking for victims where they're explicitly offering money through apps, gifts, things like that online. The third are victims, and these are people who are living the sugar life as a sugar baby or who are actively seeking abusers online. And then the fourth is a pretty general one. These are sugar baby language users. These are who are using the language probably innocently, but who are really perpetuating that use of the language that really does cause damage long term. The response types we have, first of all, are education. So just educating the public about what sugaring is about. Second of all is connecting people to resources through a landing environment through the StolenYouth website. The third is to contribute to efforts to end sugaring. The fourth is providing facts, figures, information about sugaring, particularly in Washington State. The fifth are connecting people to individual success stories, survivor stories, links to speakers and presentations. And then the fifth is information on sentencing and convicted felons, and then outcomes for abusers. We are currently in beta phase, so this is just a little bit of our alpha build. We've been testing this through a couple of different phases, but I can tell you that it's working. Even in our alpha phase, we're able to identify or intercept a number of conversations, but even in one case, get a couple of dozen posts flagged through Twitter and then removed from the Twitter platform. So it seems to be working even in our early testing. I want to share with you a couple of examples of the posts that we're going to be using that'll be going out there. So the first are posts that would go out to victims. And so somebody may be talking about, being in the sugaring world. And so this one is pretty simple. It just says, the word sugaring is just a candy-coated version of prostitution. The exchange of sex for money is not explicitly stated, but the expectation is always clear. They will spoil you in exchange for sexual conduct. Don't be fooled. Another one is, you do not need to be at the mercy of someone else. Sugaring is degrading, demoralizing, and dangerous. Don't put yourself in this situation. Say no to sugaring. For abusers, we use a bit of a different approach. So this one is, did you know that patronizing a person for sexual conduct is a crime in the state of Washington? Know the possible legal repercussions of the crime you're about to commit. Learn more at StolenYouth.org/sugarfree. Or, hey, sugar daddy, you may think what you're doing is harmless, but in the state of Washington, what you're doing is considered a crime. Paying a person for a sexual act in exchange for a fee is illegal. Know what you're doing before you act. Learn more at StolenYouth.org/sugarfree. We've created a landing page on the StolenYouth website, which is up and live, and it's at StolenYouth.org/sugarfree. And this landing page is pretty simple, but the first thing we talk about is really what sugaring is. We define the act of sugaring and why it's really a dangerous and slippery slope to child sex trafficking. We then provide information about what our goals are with Project Sugar Free, and then we have links to that information that we mentioned in our posts. So targeted to if you're a victim, what you might want to know, if you're a parent or concerned that your child might be sugaring, what you might need to know, and then if you want to know more about the law, if you're a potential abuser, and then with links to resources and information about sugaring. So that is Project Sugar Free. Our hope is that once we launch this officially in the next week, we will be collecting data and sharing that data out in terms of how many conversations we've been able to intercept with our response language, how much content we're able to get taken down, how many abusers we're able to report, and then how much traffic we can then link back to the StolenYouth site to the resources online. So that's Project Sugar Free.
Thank you so much, Alan. Now I want to open this up to the questions you had of the panelists, and I'll read them. And if you have any unanswered questions or questions you think of after the fact, you can always email those to our main email address, which is hope, HOPE, @StolenYouth.org. But there's a few questions here, a bunch of the same questions, but one person, I believe this is a question for Stacie, hopefully she's still on with her tech problems. But the question is, when prosecuting offenders, what is the sentence, and do they have to participate in a men's group?
That's a great question, and the sentence often depends on the crime charged, as well as where the crime is charged. For instance, in federal law, we have multiple child sexual abuse charges to include coercion and enticement. We have a charge for the possession of child sexual abuse material, the distribution of child sexual abuse material, the receipt of child sexual abuse material, as well as the production of child sexual abuse material. And then we also have human trafficking charges. Most of our child sexual abuse charges that relate specifically to images on the federal side start at a minimum mandatory of 5 years and go up to a maximum of 20 years. Now, so that sentence can be adjusted based on how many of those charges are actually charged. Production of child pornography starts with a minimum mandatory of 15 years with a maximum sentence of 30 years. Every offender who is prosecuted on the federal side also has to, after their sentence, they do have to do a term of supervised release. And that supervised release can also include some type of counseling, not necessarily just a men's program, but some type of counseling to deal with any mental health issues.
Thank you, Stacie. Stand by, there might be another one for you. Oh, here's a good one. What will it take for these recommendations to become laws regulating the internet?
It takes, our lawmakers to actually create laws regulating the internet as it specifically relates to child sexual abuse material. There have been some laws that have been presented over the years that have not actually passed and become law. And so it's just going to take more work, us making sure our constituents know about what's happening online. And it's going to take our lawmakers actually passing law to ensure that technology companies are protecting children online.
Thank you. And I'm looking at some of the questions that Brooke answered in the chat box, but I thought maybe one of them might be good for Brooke if she's on still. I know she had some good duties, but one question is, how early should families speak to kiddos, and what do you recommend for these conversations? And you're on mute. Oh, there you go.
All right, great. Yeah, that's a great question. Some of it does depend on kind of how the family is managing internet accessibility. So something to consider is like when kids have access to devices with internet access, what level of kind of parental monitoring is happening, that type of thing. We do believe that these conversations should be age appropriate. I dropped some resources in the chat for referencing other NGOs that have built out resources with conversation guides. And as Stacie mentioned, NCMEC also recently put a pledge out that has a great toolkit with it as well. But yes, they should be age appropriate. And I do think a great strategy is folding those conversations into kind of general digital safety conversations, so that it's part of safety. It's like when you ride your bike, you wear a helmet, right? When you're operating online, you need to be aware of these risks and you need to protect yourself in these ways. So just a few things to consider, but sent some resources through for kind of age appropriate conversation guides, and definitely starting to have these conversations when they have access to internet, and elementary school is probably a good age as well. Marnie,
another question, are your slides shareable? I saw that they said confidential on the bottom, but a few people have asked about them.
I don't think I'm able to share out the slides, but I can share a link to the full report that has everything in the slides and more. A lot of additional information and other insights we had from kids, especially around their attitudes and how they think about things. So I'm happy to share that link out for everyone.
Thank you. And one more question, because we're close to time. And there are some other people asking about different websites that were referenced, and we can send those out in the email in order to save time, specifically the one about the Department of Justice site that Stacie mentioned. So we'll send that out in our wrap-up email. But one more question. What are the ages, education level, and socioeconomics of abusers? And I know what stats I have from StolenYouth, but I don't know if Stacie, you want to take a crack at that, or?
Sure. Well, I can tell you from what we've seen just across the country, online child sexual abuse material or exploitation of children is different than human trafficking in the sense. I know in Seattle, you have a more vulnerable, socioeconomically lower population that's being abused by a more affluent population in the human trafficking space. But specifically for online child sexual abuse, it crosses all lines. We have offenders of all races. We actually have offenders of both genders, and we have offenders of all ages. One thing we are seeing a lot more recently, where historically offenders have been older men, usually, 30s and up. We're seeing a lot more younger offenders, some even high schoolers that are engaged in downloading and looking for very, I would say, aggressive child sexual abuse material, to include abuse of like babies and toddlers. So that's something we had not seen until recently, is that younger offenders that are looking for very harmful pornography online.
I keep getting on mute. One more for you, Stacie, and then we'll wrap this up. What are schools doing to curtail this activity with so much online learning? Can they?
I'm not sure. That's, something we've looked at when we've looked at prevention and what's happening. Certainly, I think everyone understands and recognizes that schools is the best way for us to do some of this prevention work, to teach kids about the dangers online. But because in the US, our school system is so decentralized, most communities have their own school board. And so it's really up to those local school boards to determine what prevention looks like in that area and what programs are being implemented. And that really varies from location to location, from city to city, from state to state. And I think, unfortunately, there have been a lot of school systems thus far that have not really done any prevention work, because COVID came the way it did. And there was a lot of pivoting having to happen just to how do we educate our kids just for, their normal school subjects, that a lot of thought was not thought about online computer access and how we protect them from that new normal.
Yeah, it's a big challenge that none of us were prepared to be in. So I feel like we're struggling to catch up, and sadly, the online exploiters always seem a step ahead of us. But I really want to thank Stacie and Brooke and David and Alan for your time and for your valuable information. We will be sending an email to everyone who signed up to participate with some of these links for you, with more resources and a link to the recording of this. I know several people have asked for that. If you'd like to continue to receive information from StolenYouth, you can email us again at hope, H-O-P-E, StolenYouth.org, and also let us know if you'd like to sign up for our next virtual event, which will be held February 25th. And lastly, if you found this evening's information and the work of StolenYouth important in the fight against child sex trafficking, I encourage you to consider investing in our work, which you can do via our website, which is www.stolenyouth.org/donate. Thank you so much for making the time this evening, and everyone have a good night. Bye-bye.